Start off with an introduction, and then as people come in, we will just welcome them. So I want to welcome all of you. I see colleagues from all fields of chemistry and from all across campus. It's so exciting to have you here. The cross lecture, as you can see from the programs, if you are missing a program, there's some around on the seats. The cross lecture is named for Professor Paul Cross, who's a distinguished physical chemist who served as chair of the Department of Chemistry from 1949 through 1961. So for those of you keeping track, that's 12 years of being chair. Professor Cross lived from 1907 through 1978, and this lecture series is dedicated to his memory. The funds to host this lectureship were a gift to the Department of Chemistry by the family of Professor Cross and by his many friends and colleagues. So we're very grateful for that donation to the department, and we're equally grateful now to our current donors who help us support our students and remain at the cutting edge of research. Okay, so with that, I now move on to my introduction for Professor David Hu. Dr. Hu is a professor of mechanical engineering and biology and adjunct professor of physics at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He earned degrees in mathematics and mechanical engineering from MIT. He was an NSF postdoctoral fellow at New York University. He's a fellow of the American Physical Society. He has been awarded the Career Award from the NSF and the Science Communication Award from the American Institute of Physics. He has not yet won the Nobel Prize, but he's won the Ig Nobel Prize twice in physics. I aspire to this. He serves on editorial boards of the Proceedings of the Royal Society B and the Journal of Experimental Biology. He's also written 2 books, How to Walk on Water and Climb Up Walls, and also The P Word. Now, I admire David on several levels. I admire how he couples scientific creativity and rigor, and I think that you'll see that here today. I admire how he builds community in his research group. So when I gave my own series of talks at Georgia Tech several years ago, David wasn't able to meet with me. He was out of town, but I did meet with several members of his group. And it was clear how much they loved the science and how much they loved working with David. Separately, I really admire his advocacy. So several years ago, one of David's papers was derided by a US congressman as being a poor use of taxpayer dollars. However, the impact of that basic research was extraordinary. David's research, that basic research, led to a simple low-cost way for physicians to diagnose urinary tract disorders in their patients. So David described the original research and its important impact in a TED Talk, which you can find online. And now, decades later, scientists find ourselves in a similar situation in which the value of basic research is being questioned by some of our elected and unelected officials, and funding is being cut. So stories about how basic research leads to unexpected advances in health and technology are especially important for us to tell now. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor David Hu. Oh. And I'm still wearing the mic. Before I sit down, I also need to present you with a plaque for the cross lectureship for this year. Thank you. Thank you. Oh. Remember to give the mic.
Thank you, Professor Keller. This very kind introduction, and what a beautiful real piece of wood plaque. That's excellent. So I'm happy I'm giving 2 lectures today and tomorrow. Tomorrow the lecture will be about these 2. These are poop, wombat poop in the shape of cubes from Australia. So I'll pass this around because some people won't be able to attend it tomorrow. Feel free to take selfies. In case you're wondering, wombats, their intestines are round, but they make the edges of that by having bands of stiffened regions that basically pulse and sculpt the liquid feces as it dries. So I'll be talking about that tomorrow, right before lunch. So today I want to tell you a little bit about things we've been actively working on. None of this work is published, but it's things I've been thinking about for a number of years, and we've been making some recent progress. You're probably familiar with this Vitruvian Man by Leonardo. Every time I do research, I usually have some kind of vision of what I want it to look like, and we usually spend a lot of time thinking of what's the one image that would capture like the essence of the research. And we thought, at least in Georgia, we have so many mosquitoes, maybe you could make the outline of a person by just sketching out where the mosquitoes were not. And this is my graduate standing in the mosquito chamber. So with that, I'll start with the thanks to my graduate student, most of all, Chris Zoll. Here's him lying in the mosquito chamber. And here's the text message he sent me after the first experiment, after which we changed our protocol for mosquito bites. So he never got bitten after that first time. This work was really possible also by Jorn Dunkel, a mathematician at MIT, who, with Chen Yifei and Alex's grad students and postdoc, really helped to analyze this 50 million data points that we found from the mosquitoes to actually make sense of their behavior. Then my own group, Shei and Ari and Miguel, worked on the birds baths that I'll get into the very end of the talk, and David and Kai has been spearheading this work on earwax. It's really nice to come back to a chemistry department. I was actually born in a chemistry department. These are my parents in Chicago. They came from Taiwan. My dad working at Applied Physics Lab, and they even still go to the ACS meetings now that they're retired. This is them right there. They taught me that nature has a lot of interesting things to tell us, and that if you're curious about things, you should just follow them. And I've been doing that since I was a kid, and I try to do that with my group. One of the first things I was curious about, this actually started with a homework assignment in a graduate class. So every class I teach, I actually try to have a course project where students come up with their own ideas. The question was, how do these insects walk on water? So what you're seeing here is actually two water striders. These insects that have legs like hairs. Their legs are literally 100 microns thick, and they use that to stand on the water surface. So this is a video which I call Two Parents Having a Discussion, where you see these insects are not only hydrophobic on their legs, but their entire bodies are able to jump and converse all without breaking through the water surface. This is me back in grad school doing these experiments with Brian Chan in John Bush's lab. And the picture that we took to basically understand this process was this, which we got inspiration from Vincent van Gogh. Maybe if you've taken a chemistry class, there's a dye called thymol blue that changes the color of the fluid depending on the pH. We shine light from below the fluid, and everywhere the light penetrates is where the insect has basically pushed the water surface. So you can see, even though the leg is just the thickness of a human hair, it's able to generate these vortices, these basically wake, similar to a rowboat, by pushing down on the water surface, generating these divots that are much larger than the thickness of the leg itself. And it's those divots, these what we call menisci, these little bubbles of air that push back and act as the blades of the oar and allows the insect to move forward, just like a rowboat, but without any blades. This is when I was in grad school, and it taught me the value of interdisciplinary research. In fact, when I started teaching at Georgia Tech, the first book that we used that mechanical engineers to study fluid mechanics, which is how boats and ships move, was actually with a photo from my research on the cover. So I was really happy that engineers are really starting to be interested in bio-inspired methods. So from this, we've continued to work with different animals. What you see here is the subject of the star of today's show, the mosquito. And this is what happens when a mosquito gets hit by a raindrop. We took almost a week to take this photo here with this is a mosquito attached to a very small hair where we basically drop raindrops over and over until we get the right image. This research showed us that when mosquitoes strike normal objects, they generally splatter. That's because the inertia of the drop is high enough they can actually break the drop, and it's the repulsion of momentum that causes the large force. But mosquitoes are like Tai Chi masters. They don't push back on the drop, and because the drop can continue going in the same direction with almost the same speed, the mosquitoes really don't get that much force at all. So by not stopping the drop themselves, the mosquitoes can survive a raindrop impact really easily, even though they're 50 times lighter than the raindrop. So it's just like getting hit by a Volkswagen Beetle. They have no problem with this impact. So this is back in 2012, and I was at a conference in Italy, a physics conference, where we basically got to, kind of like today's visit, we had meetings with chemists and physicists and engineers. And this biologist, Ring Cardet, that's him sitting on the right, he was telling me, you know, there's some really unsolved problems with mosquitoes. And one of them is that we can't trap them at all. So the way they basically have built these traps that the military has used for the last 60 years. It's called a suction trap. That you just basically have a little fan that basically creates some suction, and it pushes air that circulates back outward. So here you put some dirty socks or something the mosquitoes are going to like, and the attraction to the odors from it being pushed out brings the mosquitoes to the vicinity, and if all goes well, they'll go to the suction port and then get sucked in. So this is basically the state of the art of how we trap mosquitoes. It's only effective 50% of the time, and sometimes only 10% of the time. And it's because the issue is we don't really understand mosquito behavior. They have some kind of defense reflex. As soon as they feel air that's going towards them, they'll start to run away. So despite this trap and billions of dollars per year, we still don't have a good way of understanding how these very simple animals behave. So this project was an attempt to start to understand what is it about mosquito behavior and how can we quantify it. The first thing we usually do when we do look at these animals is I try to look in the literature, and I look for some really weird papers. This is a really good example where investigators have basically sat naked, I think they were wearing underwear, in a room and measured all the places that you get bitten by mosquitoes. And from these kind of experiments, they found that there's about 100 species. So there's 3,000 mosquito species around. They all specialize on different animals, birds and large vertebrates. And there's 100 that only specialize on humans. So if you have a field of cows and a person, they will actually just find that person and try to feed on them. And not only do they feed on these mosquitoes specialize just for humans, they specialize on specialty parts of humans. So in Georgia, we have Aedes aegypti, which likes your heads and shoulders. So they really prefer to bite that part of your body. Whereas if you go to Africa, Anopheles gambiae, which is basically the big reason why people are dying, 1 million people are dying from mosquito bites every year, 1 million people per year. And they love the smell of feet. The smell of Limburger cheese emulates the smell of feet, and they will go towards the feet while you're sleeping and try to bite your ankles. So they seem to be attracted to particular parts of the body, but what about those parts? One reason is because of the bacteria levels. So these are studies of how much sweat glands we have on your body. You've got really sweaty feet and sweaty palms, and how much bacteria populations, because of the sweat and the heat and the moisture, you've got different levels of bacteria. And people have shown that it's these combined odors along with the vision and the CO2 that brings the mosquitoes to these particular areas. But the paper that really got me excited that this is a very strange field was that this paper showing that how you sit in a room will also affect mosquito bites. This is a grad student who was basically sitting and lying with feet up in the room, and they recorded the number of bites based on these postures. And from a purely scientific perspective, you're making the same amount of carbon dioxide and your same amount of odors, but the mosquitoes get confused when they sense these odors in different order. So something about the order that they're sensing these cues is affecting how they bite. And so that's when we decided we wanted to use some new kind of equipment. So just nearby from here, Microsoft Intellectual Ventures have built this what they call the photonic century. Maybe you've heard it in the news that they basically use an infrared camera and a reflective wall to see the entire lifetime trajectory of mosquitoes when they're in a room. So you can see where everyone's going, and you can basically figure out why they did what they did. Their initial idea was to use a laser to basically shoot down these mosquitoes. But now this device is really waiting for people to figure out how to get all this data and what can we get from it. So this is one of the first videos we took of Chris wearing his sweatshirt in the room. And you can see this is that species Aedes aegypti. Don't worry, we're not going to release any mosquitoes. Someone leaning on a light switch? Oh, okay, thank you very much. But like I said, Aedes aegypti is it too bright, you think? Okay, go ahead. Aedes aegypti really loves the head and shoulders. You're producing carbon dioxide, you're producing breath odor around the head, and they really like to aggregate there. Now, the issue with this research, and I think a lot of research in the coming years, is that there's basically too much data. We basically have to basically show only small portions of the data. So even though this is just a 20-minute experiment, I'll only be showing videos where we've taken random snapshots of the mosquitoes. The number one question I get from this talk is, how do I prevent mosquitoes from biting me? And one of the answers is that what they've known from the military for a very long time is that when the army started wearing basically beige, was that when people realized that mosquitoes, apparently they evolved to follow humans living in caves, and so they look for dark spots. And for example, if you wear a completely uniform object, they'll go all around you, but if you wear half of your body just to be white, you can see they pretty much can't see the white half of your body. So this is the snapshot of where the mosquitoes have gone over 10 minutes, and you see they're really aggregating over the dark side. So they wear white colors or find close friends to wear the dark colors and have them be the bait. This shows that the intensity of the color is really important, at least for this species, Aedes, which bites in daytime and crepuscular conditions. Even though Chris is breathing the same CO2 and producing the same odors all over his body, the mosquitoes are not responsive unless they really see the combination of these cues together. So our idea is we basically after we saw how many mosquito bites Chris got, we wanted to reduce, like a mathematician, reduce our experiments down to modeling a person like a human sphere. So instead of having a grad student, we're going to have a black sphere, and we'll have to show them breathing. We're going to have CO2 coming out, and we're going to quantify how mosquitoes behave going towards a spherical human. So the first thing is, when there's no odor stimuluses in the room or no targets, mosquitoes are basically driven by noise. They're driven by randomness. And they don't have any preferential directions to fly upwards or downwards. This is their flight trajectories. And this is a distribution of all their directions they're flying up or down and all their speeds across 20 minutes. So you can see there's no preference for them to go up or down. They seem to be flying randomly, which means they're generating exactly as much lift forces as gravitational forces. They're supporting themselves in air, and it's like they're underwater. They don't really care about up or down. Most of the mosquitoes have, basically, they're like having cruise control in a car. A cruise control basically makes yourself have a constant speed, and mosquitoes do that too. They really like flying at basically 0.7 meters per second, which is about the rate of a person walking across the room. So you can outrun a mosquito, but you probably cannot outwalk it. If they're flowing slower than that, they're going to speed up, and faster than that, they're going to slow down. And if they're near walls, they basically just have this bullet-like trajectory where they don't try to modify their speed at all, and they just basically keep whatever speed they have. But for the most part, they like to keep at constant speed and just change their directions randomly. Now, to understand how they fly around a target, we have to basically create a target, and we basically try to understand two forces that mosquitoes experience. One is the acceleration of the brake, which we call F parallel. This is the force in the same direction you're traveling. You either can accelerate your car, or you can turn on the brakes, or you can even reverse direction. And the other force is the F perpendicular force, which is the force that they go towards or away from a target. Okay? And if we can basically understand mosquito behavior, it means that we can write these two forces as a function of how fast they are and how far away from the target and what direction they're going. And with all these data sets, we can start to do that. So this is, instead of my grad student, we have this black sphere. And when you basically don't breathe and you just have an object of interest, mosquitoes will fly by it because there's something interesting, but then they'll fly right past it. This is the computer simulations of those forces that I just described, where you can see mosquitoes go towards the object, but then also often quickly fly past it. And still unknown why they seem to only attack the heads of things, why they don't ever go from below. So all that description I gave you, the mathematical description, are on these plots, where basically this is the distance they are from the target, this is the speed. You can see as they get close to the target, they slow down, which means that there's something interesting there. This is the direction they're traveling as a function of their speed, and there's basically two different directions they choose. To go towards the target because they're interested in it, and once they find out there's no blood meal there, they go away. And this is the actual forces that we've measured from all these mosquitoes as a function of all those parameters, the distance, the speed, and the direction they're traveling. So we have a full description of how these mosquitoes behave, and it's good enough that we can actually make this computer game of mosquito behavior. So if you want to try it on your cell phone, we actually pay about $10 a month to have a computer basically use these forces to predict what the behaviors of mosquitoes are. You can just scan this code and it will show up. Here we have 15 mosquitoes in a room reflecting off the boundaries, and if there's no cues whatsoever, you can see they're flying completely dictated by noise. They're just flying randomly. There's no target there. Now, once there's a visual target, the ones that are facing the target and close enough will go towards it, but there's nothing to keep them there. Some of them will fly away and keep on going. Now, once we have CO2, which I'll show you next, we see that they kind of aggregate around the target, but the most attractive at all is visual plus CO2, where they basically go towards the target with great speed and stay moving around. And that's why mosquitoes are so effective, the combination of these two cues together. So here's what the CO2 plume looks like. They basically go towards the trap, and they also stick around it. Basically, it causes them to do more tumbles. So near the target, they basically change directions more and spend more time around the target. And this is this idea I said that they have very, very low speeds around the target. And they basically are not really flying towards or away. They just fly just around the target altogether. Now, what we had thought was that mosquitoes would just be like simple calculators. You take vision and you take CO2 and you would add them together, and you would basically get what it's like to be around a breathing human. But turns out once you add vision and CO2, for example, this black sphere with the CO2 coming out, you get an effect that is a lot stronger than each of those cues alone. They really, really they tend to aggregate around this target here. And in fact, if we add these heat maps that we discovered for vision and CO2, we get a decrement. We basically don't get as much attraction as we do from doing this last experiment. So this last experiment, we can basically learn what the mosquitoes' behaviors are, and then we can do a prediction. So the best we can do is having my grad student wear sort of a black hat. The problem is when the grad student wears black parts all over their body, the mosquitoes in some ways choosing between many different targets. And that can't really be resolved by our basically model. There's some decision making that they're doing, rejecting some choices before accepting another. But if you have a single really small spherical grad student with a black hat, we can do a really good job of predicting how the mosquitoes go towards them with just the spheres alone. So we hope that this experiment is going to lead to basically new types of traps. We can imagine traps where we can say how many mosquitoes are within a certain vicinity. For example, these are the cumulative distributions of all those mosquitoes I showed. This is just from vision. This is CO2. This is the combination. And you can see once you add cues, you can see how many mosquitoes are within a certain distance of you. And now we can actually predict what their behavior is from this motion. So that's the end of the mosquito part of the talk. Now, I'm going to talk about earwax, I guess, in levels of increasing grossness. So the first thing that I get when I talk about earwax is that there's this paper in Nature Genetics showing that there's two types of earwax. People that have dry earwax, which is everyone with Asian descent, and then everyone else in the world who has wet earwax. And the theory is that sweat glands evolve differently because Asians evolved kind of in colder climates, and basically it affected the way their earwax looks. All right, that's grossness level 1. Okay, grossness level 2, earwax is produced kind of like sweat glands. So we actually have little holes in our skin, but what comes out of it is not just a liquid. So sweat glands are kind of like this, where you just see this empty hole and you get a sweat bead. But earwax comes out like a stick. So in my area, we call that viscoelastic. It means it's got properties of being a solid and a liquid. And it turns out that's actually key to how it works, how we think it evolved, but also key to why it's so troublesome. Like Freddie wrote down here on Hearing Aid Forum, hey, I struggle with earwax and my ear aids get plugged very often. Now, one of them has abundant wax, and how can I get it out? So, well, Freddie, this talk is dedicated to you. Now, the other thing about studying biology using engineering methods is that, it's great that there's so many animals out there. They really give you some insight on, which things have stuck around. And one thing is that whales are mammals too, and even they have earwax. This is a whale. They put some steak knives in the whale. He died a long time ago. But whales have earwax that's about 30 centimeters long, like this long, and it stays in their heads so long that they can actually record the passage of stressful events in the ocean. So they can see when climate change occurred, and they can see it all in the stress levels in the earwax. So all these animals have earwax. What about humans? Why do we have earwax? So sometimes, Moshe Efrat, this MD who had this brilliant idea to put his videos online, he's got 16 million views of this video. Comment number 1, this video is disgusting and absolutely repulsive. Comment 2, but I also purposefully searched for it and watched it. Okay, so that's the viscoelasticity of earwax. So why in the world do we have this? And the other thing that gets down to what your earwax is like, it depends on how wet it is. So if any of you gotten swimmer's ear, earwax is incredibly good at soaking up water, and that's a part of it, how it protects the ear. So this first video, this is basically after you go swimming, that's what earwax looks like, kind of like peanut butter. When earwax comes out of your body naturally, this is what it looks like, 28% water. And at the end of your earwax's lifetime, this is what it looks like. So it changes dramatically, going from like a gooey, oozy thing to something that's like crinkly and brittle. And it turns out that's also important too in this story. And in case you're wondering where I got all this earwax from, volunteers. In fact, I'll pass around this. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So I showed you whales produce earwax, humans produce earwax, and we've been trying to remove it for the last 2,000 years. You can look at the earliest kinds of devices from Aulus Cornelius. They said, okay, well, why don't we have this iron pick remove the earwax? This is a samurai having the earwax removed. And the reason why we need picks is because biologically, digits, which are the things that end of our paws, have evolved to be too wide to put into your ears. Not sure why that is, but we basically, in fact, if you ask doctors, how should I clean my ear? And they would say, don't put anything in your ear that's smaller than your elbow. And generally, you're going to have more chance of damaging your ear than actually protecting your ear. And all animals, they generally don't put any claws in, mostly because it doesn't fit. So why are we putting things in our ears? Well, one reason is because the body is an ecosystem. And I'll show this with the birds too at the end of the talk. We have parasites and we have symbionts. We have things that are living basically in symbiosis. And then we have, basically it's this complex ecosystem all across our bodies, all across our skin, and including our ears. This is the last 50 years of medical literature talking about people that came to the doctor. Generally, if you have an ear mite, which lives in your ear, I would say naturally, you don't go to the doctor for these microscopic things, but as soon as things become ants, mosquitoes, flies, moths, beetles, butterflies, cockroaches, erasers, or cotton balls, you'll generally go to the doctor. And I think there's Legos up here too. Yeah, it's covered up. So these things are getting stuck in ears, and the literature says, hey, no one really sure what earwax is for, but it seems that maybe it participates in forming a natural barrier to insects, because when humans evolved and animals evolved, we didn't have Legos around or erasers or cotton balls, but these insects were certainly have been getting into our ears and our ancestors' ears for probably millions of years. They say maybe fatty acids in the earwax could be used to repel insects. But surprisingly enough, no one's actually collected the earwax to actually study this. And this is a paper that gave me the idea that I was on the right track, that earwax is a very special material. These two individuals, I think they asked their grad student to collect bacteria from different parts of their body and expose it to earwax. But you can see, ceremone is the scientific word for earwax. You can see grad students that basically found stool, which is poop, and exposed to earwax. The earwax killed 80% of the bacteria in poop, 50% in septum. Skin lesions, it killed 50%, 52% of the bacteria. I don't know how they got open wounds. That's a little suspicious. But 58% of bacteria in open wounds was killed by earwax. It seems pretty good, pretty good. Even though the Chinese translation for earwax is shi, which means ear shit. It doesn't seem like shit to me. It actually seems like pretty useful. So this is the star of our story. Ear mites are a little bit too small to work with, but we can find ants where we can see how they deal with earwax, how they deal with being touching earwax. And one of the big things that we learned from ants is that ants really don't like earwax. This is an ant trying to groom earwax off. It really doesn't like it. This is a very simple experiment. You could basically, if you put 100 ants in a beaker and leave, the ants will be all gone. But if you put earwax in the beaker, well, the ants actually, it's interesting, they can climb it when it's really thick because they have little picks on the edge of their feet. They can climb it like a wall. But once it gets really thin, they fall off. And this is pretty rare. You don't see insects falling to the ground all over you, at least on natural surfaces. The fact that they actually touch these surfaces and fall off, that's a failure in nature. One of the reasons that what you see is so rare is because even though we take these insects for granted in the plants, they have this evolving arms race to control each other. The plants want certain insects to climb that help them, and they want all the insects not to climb. And the insects, they want to climb everything so they can find food and shelter. So they evolved all this complex surfaces of tipped claws and hairs and pads. And what the ants have, they have these things called adhesive liquids. So at the very end of the tip of an ant pad is actually a little drop generator that generates a drop that attaches to things. And drops only stick to things if you have a material that's called hydrophilic. You've probably heard of glass being hydrophilic. Water sticks to glass, but oily things are hydrophobic. So water will beat up on oils. And the amazing thing about earwax, it sounds like it has the word wax in it, but it's not a wax at all. In fact, if you looked at, in Professor Keller's lab, we looked at paraffin wax, beeswax produced. These are all hydrophobic. But earwax is not waxy. It actually absorbs water. So which means we need to start a movement to change the name of earwax. We need to call it ear gel or something like that because it's not waxy. Here's experiment showing that that these earwax actually really is less adhesive than glass. So glass is actually, because glass is very hydrophilic, earwax is 100 times less adhesive than glass. And why is it less adhesive? Has to do not just with the chemistry itself, but the way the earwax is produced. I showed you that little earwax pore. The earwax comes out like spaghetti strips, and it forms this porous network, really, really small holes that absorbs water. So this is what happens when you go swimming. When you go swimming, water gets in your ear, and you may hear it stop sloshing around because earwax acts like a really good sponge. It's not waxy, but actually absorbs the liquid. And the basic size of the hole, this is a little CT scan of where all the water goes within the pores. And as ants crawl on this thing, you can imagine the speed of the absorption is going to dictate by the volume of the drops. Well, the ant drop volume is a fraction of a microliter. So the time to absorb it's about a 10,000th of a second. So when ants walk at around 15 hertz, every time they take a step, their little adhesive drop, which they would use to cling onto this thing, is just instantly absorbed. And so they can no longer climb. So that prevents them from moving. But earwax has also a second trick up its sleeve to prevent ants from going in. And is that a lot of people that you know, maybe of older age, have a lot of hairs in their ears. And this basically creates this kind of jungle where the earwax is coating the ant at every step. So we basically coated the top of this aluminum slide, we made it so it's 10 times the ant's weight. So the ants have to rub up against this thing. And you see, once ants are coated with this thing, they really don't like to go very far. They're really stuck because they're spending most of the time just trying to remove this gross earwax. This is what a clean ant looks like. Generally, they have very, very little debris. Even though the world's covered in small particles, they're very good at grooming. They have these specialized organs to remove them. But the earwax, the properties of the earwax are basically outsmarting their grooming mechanism. You can see all these yellow spots are parts on their body where we've given the ant a couple minutes, and this is the best it could do. So the reason why the earwax can be groomed has to do with the way their grooming is evolved. So insects basically have to have their own vacuum cleaners and brushes with them. So on the tip of an ant legs, they have that brush and a comb. And the structures that evolved in nature that they try to remove are generally particulate. So when they basically have an elbow, they rub their antenna through their elbow. They've got these little hairs that push the particles aside. And these are tuned to have, there's 3 different length scales of the hair so they can remove big particles, medium, and small. But the issue is that earwax is not a particle. It's basically a viscoelastic fluid. So it's basically like this kind of stuff. But we never knew humans could produce something that insects and reptiles and amphibians have been honing for millions of years. For example, if you've ever looked at a frog, the reason they can catch prey is that their saliva is very different than ours. They're what they call shear thinning. So that means the saliva is basically really gooey and sticky when you're not pushing on it with very much displacement. But once it slows down, once you speed it up, it becomes really, really low viscosity, like water. And so that's how a frog captures the prey. It shoots its tongue out, the tongue slaps up against the insect, and the insect, it hits it so fast that this saliva liquefies and it coats all the insect. But once the insect stops moving, when the impact is over, it becomes a solid again. That's very similar to this pitcher plant fluid. This pitcher plant eats flies for a living. You can see it generates these saliva-like threads, these viscoelastic threads. And we see earwax falls in this very similar to this frog-like material. This is the range. So earwax has a range of viscosities depending on how quickly you deform it. And because the ants are walking at a constant speed, they're causing the earwax to liquefy. And as soon as the ants stop walking, it solidifies into this junk that they can't get off their bodies because of the methods of combing. Can't deal with viscoelasticity, can only deal with particles. So the last thing I'll say about earwax is that it's also self-cleaning. So you saw that it only works if it's in very, very thin layers. If it's too thick and gunky, the ants can actually climb on with ice picks. And so we actually have 2 mechanisms to prevent the earwax from accumulating in our ears. One, they did an experiment where they take a little marker and paint the inside of your ear, and they waited, And that marker dot will actually travel about the same speed as your nails grow. So the marker dot will travel to the outside of your ear in about 10 weeks. And that matches the time scale where earwax dries. So earwax loses liquids in that same time period, and it goes from basically a soft state that coats the inside of your ear to a brittle state that basically crumbles and falls out anytime you kind of like wiggle, chew, or do some kind of movements. So it basically has a way of self-cleaning itself. So we've seen insect capture methods using stickiness. Pitcher plants use slip. Earwax uses a totally different method where they absorb materials and they coat insects, and hopefully that tells them to at least stay out of the ears for a little longer before they come back next time. So I couldn't end the talk with earwax because some people don't like gross things, so we have to have a palate cleanser. So we're going to talk a little bit about feathers. I'm going to start with these videos that we took with our collaborator in China of hundreds of birds seeking out water. So it's an unsolved question that mammals, we generally don't seek out water. I mean, humans bathe, but humans are an exception. But most mammals don't bathe on a regular basis. And every bird has their own stereotypical ways to bathe. Some of them like these pools, some of them need to have open water. And all of them don't just sit in it, but they basically go in and flap their wings really, really rapidly. This one only bathes in rainstorms, so waits until rainstorms bathes. And there's some birds that only bathe when another bird's bathe. When another bird's bathe, it takes the water that has been splashed off and bathes them there. And on average, these birds are all bathing quite seriously for 30 seconds at a time. So why do birds want to bathe? And it's not just wild birds. This is Jenny, who raises a basically mental support pigeon at Georgia Tech. She basically bathes this pigeon once a week. And in fact, if she doesn't bathe the pigeon will get very angry and start banging and demanding its weekly bath. So this is that pigeon, 3 minutes in the bath, doing the same kind of procedures. And then after the 3 minutes over, it kind of knows what's happened. And it says, okay, bath time's up. The pigeon knows, well, I don't know why the pigeon knows why it bathes, but we certainly don't. So the question is, can we understand why these birds are bathing? Is there a secret that we can learn from them? Then I came across this very interesting paper, which led me to think that there might be some really interesting applications of understanding birds bathing. One is that they basically prevented birds from bathing, and they gave it an array of strings. Imagine this obstacle course to fly through. And they showed that basically as the bird flies, it actually crashes into more strings if it's dirty. Can you imagine a plane hitting more things if it's dirty? It would not be a good idea. But the bird loses its flight accuracy when it's dirty, and when it's given one bath, it flies accurately again. So there's something about that single bath is enough to gain something about its aerodynamics. So that's very different from how we know about flying structures. One idea is that the birds could be just simply traumatized by its parasites. So this is a great book, Fleas, Flukes, and Cuckoos by Rothschild and Clay, showing all the body parts on a bird and the different kinds of parasites that live there. Some of them, like the feather mites, they actually might be there to take up space so other parasites don't. But these, like most animals, wild animals, they have all these parasites. The bath might just help keep the parasite load down. It's still unknown. So what we did in our lab is we work with basically what we call window kill. So birds that are unfortunately hit windows and basically are frozen, and they're kept by the Audubon Society so that people can count how many birds are dying in this fashion. And we take them and we can basically measure how water starts going through their feathers. So this is basically a water drop traveling through, rising through the feather. And they've done some similar experiments with cormorants and other birds where it's shown that feathers birds are really good at absorbing water. They're not as absorbent as earwax, but they're pretty good. And we can actually calculate how much water a bird absorbs by estimating the air spaces in a single feather. And there's been these great studies where they've actually studied bird insulation, how feathers evolved, chickens have almost 10,000 feathers, where penguins have 100,000 feathers. And we can basically extrapolate how much water these birds absorb, and we get a scaling law that's actually pretty similar to what we measure in the lab from these dunking experiments that we showed. So overall, birds absorb about 10% of their body weight, and that's about 10 times as much as you absorb. This is one of the first experiments we did in the lab. We were studying wet dog shaking. And if you go to the bathtub and you come out, if you let the water drip, the water that stays on your skin is about a 1/50 of an inch layer thick, and that's about 1% of your body weight. And so you can imagine dogs have about 2%, like a dog have about half a pound of water, this Labrador in his fur. But birds are incredibly heavy after they bathe. They basically gain all this water, and still kind of a mystery why that is. Bit more than mammals, but less than insects, which can get drowned in a single water drop. This is an ant that gets stuck in a drop of water because the surface tension of water, the same forces that keep the water strider up, keep the ant down, and the ant can't cross. So one of the ideas that we had for why birds bathe was basically maybe it's the after-bath ritual, because you saw when birds were bathing, they basically did all this shaking activity, and still really not understood. Like, if you saw someone on the street doing this, you'd think, what the heck? But we see birds doing all the time. And they call this behavior called rousing. Why would anyone want to do this? I mean, you see, if you look really closely at these videos, you see what they call feather dust. Anyone who raises birds or lives in chicken farms, they actually get they can get lung problems because feathers, with all their surface area, something about the way the feathers rub against each other, it generates a lot of debris. You can see some of this debris just flying out. And every time they flap, they also will generate these kind of structures. Maybe they bathe so they can flap and remove some of this debris, or maybe the flapping does something special. We started getting inspired to look at this vibration by this paper that showed that bird feathers are actually porous structures, and they're actually completely composed of individual hairs. So what actually keeps a bird aloft is the Velcro activity. It's what they call these passive fasteners. But basically, there's these microscopic hooks on each barb, which is each little part of the feather, that hook on each other. And the combined, each one of these barbs can only support something like 0.3 millinewtons. But if you've got millions of barbs on the bird's body, you can actually support several times your body weight, which is what you need to fly. So if that bird was flying into objects when it wasn't having a bath, maybe it was because its feathers were not having the appropriate configuration to basically support its body weight. That would be enough reason to look for baths if you can't fly, because naturally your body is actually composed of pores. Your body actually doesn't have aerodynamic forces. It only has the forces when these barbs are hooked together. So we did these. We wanted to mimic the motion of the bird wing. This is how we generally start things in the lab. We have just a simple metal ruler, the kind you find in elementary school, and we just wanted to mimic the couple 2 to 3 hertz vibration that the wing has as it's flapping after the bath. And this is the closest thing I've seen to magic in a while. This is that same experiment with the. And this is what a disheveled feather looks like. We take a fan, and we basically blow it in all sorts of directions, and the feather gets disheveled. And then we basically start plucking the ruler. You can see it's got barbs that are displaced. None of them are really attached. And after a single flap, you're going to see, let me fast forward here. You see it goes from this state to this state. You see that? And with every successive flap of the wing, it gets more and more and more organized. So a bird would love to have something like this because it has millions of barbs. You saw that chicken had 10,000 feathers. Birds are already preening 10% of their lifetimes. It can't preen each of these one individually. It has to have an autonomous way to link all these barbs together. And if it can flap at certain frequencies to make its feathers go from an unorganized state to an organized state, that would be a good example of taking these wasteful vibrations and using them for a good purpose. You can imagine we might have ropes that are built out of this kind of material. It's kind of like a Velcro that's on a flexible material, and that you don't attach it by pushing, you attach it by vibrating. We started to play around with that a little bit. It's actually very difficult, but you can 3D print the same structures that these feathers have. They're not adhesive like ants. They don't have any wet parts, but they literally have small hooks. You can 3D print these, and at certain vibration frequencies that are not too crazy, like this bird feather on a motor, you can vibrate them and you can get these things to reattach. So maybe you'll see machines that can basically reattach and become whole again without touching. So thanks for being a great audience. This is the P-word all guide, all about puberty, and these are all the places that I've been happy to be. The GRC, which is in Ventura Beach, I recommend at that conference. That's every 2 years. I'll be at Northwestern next week, then in China, then Houston. If any of you are interested in biology, I was telling the grad students at lunch is that I think you basically have to be around the biologists. So I recommend going to this conference, which is free. Society of Integrative Comparative Biology is free for all graduate students. You just have to do some volunteer work. It'll be Portland this year and Adhesion Society. If anything interesting biology papers, you can recommend to me for editing at Proceedings of Rural Society B. But thanks a lot. I'm happy to open the floor for any questions.
I'm happy to let you drive, but while you're answering a question, maybe I'll look at who is next, and then as a reminder, if you could repeat the question.
Okay, for the Zoom. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It's still sharing, right? Okay, so the question is, why do we make the artificial grad student have basically just a spherical ball with a white rod? Why do we have it dark here? Basically, to make this mathematical model, we need to have these mosquitoes attracted to a single point. The problem is that things in nature are not single points. We don't have spherical cows or spherical grad students. So we wanted things as basically point-like as possible that the mosquitoes could see. So we got something like this. And the other thing is these algorithms, they need to have a lot of data to track. For example, we originally started with just painting a spot on the floor, but then we basically did not have enough tracks. So we wanted to have a spot that was equally distant between the floor and the ceiling. Because once they start interacting with the floor and the ceiling, we can't use that data points to model. So we wanted basically a floating grad student in the air that's a single point. And so that's what we got. But basically these, for example, once you have just the visual target, they don't care about the rod. But for example, something like this, we were trying to make no grad student at all. We just wanted the CO2 to come out of an invisible location. This says that they're seeing things that are not just black or white. They're also seeing blockages. So they call this steric influences. If they bump into stuff, it makes them, I don't know, angry, and they keep on wanting to do that. So I don't know why, and that's not in our model, why they're trying to attack this whole rod, but they're searching everywhere for a blood meal. It comes from the bottom, and it's cold. So when we do these simulations, because it's cold and a little bit heavier, it tends to kind of sink in this fashion. So it's possible that maybe they're following the CO2 as well. Yeah. We'll get to it more later. Yeah. Okay, so the question is is that how do the mosquitoes target the different parts of your body? Because what I showed was that they go towards things they can see and the CO2. I think I've heard that there is some CO2. Oh, I got to be careful about this. Maybe there's some CO2 produced around your body. I mean, it's living cells, but definitely the most from our head. How they figure out basically the different parts of the body, that's still really an unsolved question. The ones Jeff Riffle, who I met today, who's a real on-campus expert, they've identified your basic skin has lots of crevices where bacteria lives there, and they basically eat things and produce odors. And everyone has different skin pHs and temperatures that has different colonies and different ecosystems of bacteria. And the ones in our feet have particular smells. So I think that is odor. So I'm guessing they get attracted to you by the CO2 and by seeing you, but then they're looking for the feet. So I'm guessing they're going to go to the head first and go towards the feet, but we haven't studied that yet. So that's a good question.
I saw we're there, then
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the question is, what about the huge diversity of birds, and how does their basically decisions affect whether they bathe or not? And I mean, that's a great thing about biology. You can see maybe some nuances based on their techniques. Just to bring up a few counterexamples, hummingbirds, which one of the reasons we got into this study because someone owns a hummingbird farm in Costa Rica, and they noticed that hummingbirds bathe for about 1 second. They just dive into water and dive out. That's like my kids washing their hands. They're like, well, oh, okay, I'm done. Does that actually do anything? So there's that question. Why would it need to take 30 seconds if Frank is taking 1 second to bathe? Why don't I just take 1 second? There's birds that don't have access to water, quite a few desert birds. In fact, chickens, the #1 bird in the US, hates baths, does not like water. Chickens prefer dust baths. So they've somehow evolved some pairs, I don't know, well, they don't fly, so some of these things I showed with the feathers may not be applicable. But maybe something to do with their parasite load or something else. They use dust. It can satisfy their needs. And still yet, there's some birds that do something called anting, which means they bathe in ants. And they use the acid produced from the ants, basically like alarm response, to get clean. I don't know. So there's still lots of unsolved questions. The big thing is that no one is studying bird bathing. Like, people are only studying, basically, it's kind of like falls in between the niches because it's like a material science problem. It's kind of a chemistry problem. They've got the gland that spreads oils, kind of aerodynamics problem. So it's just a question that's out there.
You mentioned on microscopic level birds have various amount of feathers, but more about their structure. Does that vary? And if so, is that a particular reason why you chose that feather in your study and that game?
Okay, so when we estimate how much water birds have, yes, we basically, you're right, birds have many different feathers, contour feathers, down, some for thermal insulation, some with strong aerodynamic effects like these, which are the primary ones we study. We think that these feathers that are used to lengthen the wing are really important for generating lift. But why do they need to bathe their whole bodies then? Why don't they just bathe those wingtips? I don't know, that's a very good question. There's a huge diversity of feathers, and no one, I think, has really looked at their interaction with water. They have looked at, the closest thing they've looked at is the effect of the uropygial gland. We have hair follicles all over our bodies, and we have oil glands with each hair follicle. That's why hair gets greasy. But for some reason, birds have decided we don't want to have any oil glands. We just have a single gland in the middle of our back. We're going to call that uropygial. And every time we want to preen, we're going to like go over there and grab some oil and spread it all out. That's used for waterproofing, but it's still an unknown question, like why do they need to bathe their whole bodies? What the heck are they doing with all this splashing type of stuff? Maybe most of it seems to be affecting the body, but that's not something we're studying. So that's a good question. Thank you.
We have a question from the online audience, which is, are there known chemical or physical attractants that lead mosquitoes to each other, not just to the target? So do mosquitoes indicate to each other the location of a target?
So I had studied swarming for a good number of years, and when we basically saw like all these basically high intensity numbers of mosquitoes, we thought there could be some interaction between the mosquitoes. So the question is, can mosquitoes, like, do they give each other signals to say this is where a cue is? We've tracked from the 58 million data points in all these trajectories. We do see sometimes mosquito following the leader. So once in a very, very rare instance, you'll see mosquito following another, which is probably not by chance because it happens over a few seconds. But for the most part, they don't really have the power to communicate over long distances. Male mosquitoes will look for females based on the sound of their wings. They have different sizes, and the wings beats will have different sounds, but those don't travel very long distances. We've only used female mosquitoes in this study because we care about like blood, and only females mosquitoes suck blood. So we think it's pretty unlikely that mosquito will see each other and follow them. But there's definitely an instance of that. They do that for mating. For example, there's male mating swarms where you'll see like a cloud of mosquitoes. They're there because they're trying to sort of attract a female, and midges do the same thing. And so I think there's a lot of them. They can do some cooperative effects, but on the individual level, the data doesn't seem to show that. They're mostly just on their own, and they're just all following the same cues. That's why they're getting to the same places. We tried to look at odor a little bit. One of the issues is that we don't do an experiment in a wind tunnel, so we do it in a closed room. We actually built, so the question is, have we looked at other cues? And we built traps. We built actually these suction traps that basically circulate air. And the unfortunate problem, if you have a closed room and a suction trap, you don't need any kind of cues to catch mosquitoes. They'll all get stuck in the trap because we're in a room with nothing else. They're all gonna eventually go towards it. In fact, we did put my grad students' sweaty socks, well, glass from the sweaty socks that were put in a little more scientific than that. But we did take the sweaty socks, and they didn't attract any more mosquitoes than just the visual cue alone. So in this room where it's needed to have this software and the infrared cameras with no wind, it doesn't seem like you need to do very much. You don't need odor. It doesn't seem like that's necessary. But we're working on it. Right now we're working on malaria mosquitoes, which has a parasite that grows and makes the mosquitoes really, really thirsty because their stomach gets shrunk because the parasite is taking up the space. So we'll see if that maybe makes them hungrier to other types of things. But Aedes seems like they're fine. We did do a heat cue. So the question is, would a hot CO2 make a difference? So what people know in the literature is that different cues have different zones of effectiveness. If you're basically like a meter away, your mosquito eye is basically the only thing that you can really see in a room with no wind. But only once you get really close by can you actually feel the heat. And they use those other cues to determine if they're actually going to make a blood meal. So they're going to sort of find the right place, find the right capillary, and choose. So our model, so this basically camera it loses track of the mosquitoes once they land. So we can only basically track if they're going towards it, but once they actually land, they kind of disappear. So I'm guessing, I think the heat might change their close behavior, but basically for us to basically use this camera the way it is, because there's a shadow zone behind the object, we have to have cues that act over long distances. And we have used a heating pad, but we did not really see see any big differences. And also this, for example, this you can see, even though it's not heated, mosquitoes are still coming from above. Yeah. Okay, the question is, how do the 3,000 species of mosquitoes, how do they determine different species? I don't know. I don't think mosquitoes are smart enough to see like a chicken-shaped object from a person-sized object. I do think they have different odors, and definitely different parasites definitely are extremely tuned to have. There's generalist parasite and there's specialists. Specialists are extremely tuned to that particular organism. Like, in fact, the parasites that feed on birds have special hooks that really work best on bird feathers, and they can't actually climb on other things. Even among humans, a project that I've wanted to work on, but I'm still has been on hair lice. Pet project on hair lice. Hair lice depends on different kinds of hair. So actually, African American people, they cannot get hair lice generally in the US because the hair lice that is around here does not crawl on kinky hair because they're feet. So I'm guessing maybe sometimes they go towards the wrong one, but basically if they can't land, they'll go away. But there's a huge amount of specialization in the mechanics of like how they crawl, but also maybe the odors. Because like we don't have any hair generally. Our skin is basically hairless, so bacteria, we smell extremely differently from like a bear or from a dog just because of the lack of hair. So I think we have a totally different smell, and mosquitoes, they must be really attuned to that because they seem to be pretty specific. Yeah, they don't, and I'll mention this is actually from I'm glad we have the last question from a high school student. So good job, Mom, for bringing the K through 12 here. They basically fly so that they have the lift force that's exactly equal to their gravity. So they don't tend to basically float upwards or go downward. They don't have a preference for flying up or flying down. They just kind of just basically completely balance the gravitational force. And what their direction is just completely determined by random noise. Like they'll just choose different directions. And so that's why I said it was underwater. Because a fish underwater has the base of the bladder, a swim bladder, so it basically has no net gravity. And so basically it just goes up and down. And I don't think they're dictated by noise. But if you looked at fish swimming in an aquarium, maybe it might sort of look somewhere similar to this. This noise is a really critical thing. I didn't focus too much on this talk, but in animals, that's a big way they explore the world. Mosquitoes, they really don't know if they can only see a meter away from them. If they basically have no way to explore their world, they've got to have noise. They've got to explore the different regimes. So in your future, maybe as you go through different fields, I remember you told me you're going to major in music and like some other field. Keep on doing that like noisy path as you figure out your path, because that's what mosquitoes do as they look for a blood meal.
Before we take our last question, I do want to invite you afterwards. There is a reception in PhD 102. So please join us there afterwards, no matter what department you're in. It's such a pleasure to have all of you here from all across the university. So let's take our last question, and then at the end, we'll thank David. That then results in the shape.
The question is, why do they need water at all if I've shown there's like some benefits of just shaking? If you look at the really, really small scale, like feather dust and other kinds of small particles, the smaller you get, the harder it is to remove something. We did this study where we looked at basically dogs shaking and all these other things. Once you get to that scale, van der Waals forces and all these forces, you just can't remove it from inertia because the particles are just too lightweight. You've got to sort of absorb them in some kind of other phase. And ultimately, that's kind of like why we take a bath too. We were trying to accumulate all this stuff. Like if you had to bathe yourself just like the way you basically sweep the rug, it would take a very long time. But water, because it can take the shape of its container, it can basically take these things along with the ride, and all the things will go. But no one's really measured what happens. Bird bath water is pretty dirty, I tell you. It's actually filled with oil, strangely enough.
With that,
Thank you. Thank you. And if anyone has the wombat poop, maybe they could bring it up.